And we are recording. So good evening and welcome, educators. You've joined the Education Civil Rights Alliance webinar training for our group in 2020, the Educators for Student Equity. It's a new group we created this year to reach out to educators to make sure that they have the tools and the resources available to be passionate advocates for education civil rights for marginalized children. This is the 7th in our series of 8 trainings since January, monthly trainings, January through August, so our last one will be next month. My name's Maryann. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm director of the Education Civil Rights Alliance, which is convened by the National Center for Youth Law. ECRA is an alliance of over 70 organizations, many organizations that I'm sure you've heard of, like NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, National Women's Law Center, MALDEF, Lambda Legal, Southern Poverty Law Center, ACLU, and of course, the wonderful 2 unions that we have represented here tonight, NEA and AFT. So we work on trying to advance the education rights of marginalized children across the country. So very happy to have you all here tonight. A couple of reminders to start. Don't forget to mute yourself when you're not talking, and also please unmute yourself when you wish to talk so that we can hear you. If you're using a phone, please don't put us on hold. We can get hold music and that can disrupt a whole session. And also, again, we are recording this session, so just want to let you know that. So I'm thrilled tonight to be joined by 3 wonderful advocates who will lead the discussion tonight on equity protections for students, best practices for district advocacy. Dr. Maryann Woods-Murphy is joining us. Not only is she New Jersey Teacher of the Year and a talent development and professional learning specialist with more than 30 years in the classroom, she is also, and I know this is the most important honor for her, one of Education Civil Rights Alliance 14 leading educator ambassadors for equity. Our ambassadors, our LEAE members, as we call them, are shaping ECRA's educator engagement work across the country. So thank you for being here, Maryann. We are also joined tonight, I am thrilled to have Dr. Lisa Thomas joining us. She is a senior education policy analyst with the American Federation of Teachers, providing research and programmatic support to that national union. And of course, AFT, as I mentioned, is an ECRA member. And we are also joined tonight, I am thrilled to say, by Eric Harrington, JD, who is joining us, who's Senior Counsel for the National Union and ECRA member, National Education Association. So welcome to Lisa and Eric. Great.
Good to be here.
I invite the educators who are on Zoom to put in the chat box their name, pronouns, location, and education role, if they feel comfortable doing so. We'd love to know kind of who we're talking with. So I see we already have one person from Harlem, New York. Anyone else want to enter in the chat box who they are, where they're from, and what their education role is? For anyone who hasn't used Zoom a lot, although I'm sure most of you have, the chat box is down at the bottom. If you move your cursor down to the bottom, you'll see chat kind of in the middle. Anyone else? If not, you can add into the chat box as we go along. We have Maureen, elementary educator from Delaware, great. Rena Robinson, she, her from Vallejo, California. Youth service specialist serving justice involved youth, great. Awesome. Ruth Rundon from Coffeyville, Mississippi. Great, so we have folks from all over. and middle school science teacher from New York City, special education and gifted teacher. Great. All right, well, it sounds like we have kind of a diverse group of educators with us, which is wonderful. If you're, again, comfortable doing this, if you can put in the chat now to answer the following sentence. So in a few words, literally like 3 to 4 words, complete the following sentence: with a lens of equity for marginalized students, I am passionate about. So if you can complete that sentence so that we know what's bringing you to this discussion. Technology equity, yes, that is a huge issue. And obviously, since particularly, it's always been a huge issue, but it's an even huger issue since COVID hit. And we have a lot of education, distance education going on. And frankly, it looks like we're in for a lot more of that in the coming year. Supporting my ELL students, very important population that so often doesn't get the services that they need and the translation services that their families need to participate. Learning about disability disparities, great anti-racist strategies, and ELL and students with disability, great. The opportunity gap, absolutely. Trauma, resilience, informed care, yep. Instead of kicking all the kids out that are experiencing trauma, how about we actually give them trauma-informed care and keep them as part of the education community, which is where they belong. Racial equity, culturally relevant curriculum, awesome. Thank you for sharing. That's really, really helpful to know. One more thing, if you feel comfortable putting in the chat, again, just a few words, any questions that you'd like to make sure get answered tonight. We'll be talking about best practices in district advocacy with regard to equity for marginalized students. So what question would you like answered? Again, just in a few words, if you want to put that in the chat so that we can make sure that if we don't answer them during the initial presentations, at least we can make sure to cover them during the Q&A. Any burning questions you all have? I'll give you a couple minutes. And also you can type them in at any point during the conversation, and I'll try and keep an eye on the chat box as we go forward. All right, well, if you have questions that you think of, feel free to put them in the chat. Here we go. Is there a way to find out how a district uses federal, state, and local funds to support students with disabilities and ELLs? So figuring out what your district is doing with the monies from federal and state. And where do educators get reliable sources of information? Good questions. Got to have the information if you want to be effective advocates. So that's important. All right. Great. Before I hand the metaphorical microphone over to Lisa, I did want to share, we had talked as we were preparing for this session about sometimes when you're talking about racial equity and other dimensions of equity, sometimes terminology is thrown out there that might be confusing or might be unclear, or people might have differing approaches to the meaning of something. So I just typed into the chat box a glossary that seems to be pretty useful in terms of identifying some of the terminology that we may be using tonight, or that you may have in other equity related conversations. So feel free to use that if that's helpful. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Lisa Thomas. Again, thrilled to have you joining us this evening. And now I will pull up your slides as I have you take it away.
Thank you. All right, so if we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so good evening, everyone, and thank you. As Miriam said, can everyone hear me first and foremost? Because sometimes the sound quality, great. So, one of the biggest challenges that educators face, and it has been a while since I've been in the classroom, but I come from a family of educators and I hang out with teachers all the time, whether it's physically or virtually these days. And we're literally in the middle of our convention. We often hear, I can't do this, or I don't have team support, or my building administrator hasn't approved this culturally responsive curriculum or this equity framework. But I would push back and say it really starts in the mirror. And so you can start by asking yourself, what can I do as a person, as an individual, to meet the needs of students who have been historically marginalized in my building, in my community, in my classroom? And so these are things that you can do to start the process or recalibrate the process of creating an anti-racist space in your classroom or in your community. Next slide. Currently, we have a lot of children, a lot of kids, a lot of communities that have been impacted by what's going on with COVID. Over 7.5 million students who have been identified as students with disabilities have been impacted by closures. Currently, there are 124,000 schools that have been closed or in some state of transitioning back to opening or reopening. And currently over 55.1 million students who are impacted by school closures and will be impacted in the fall with some iteration of a reopening, whether it's 100% virtual, whether it's hybrid, whether it's a combination of hybrid or closing, we don't know, but the challenges are real. And so we have to figure out, what does this look like from an equity standpoint? The going from 0 to 100% virtual in a span of 8 weeks taught us and showed us just how inequitable access is for many of our children. And these inequities and these cracks and this exposure was really on full display this spring, particularly for Black and Brown children, when they didn't have access to technology, when they didn't have access to devices, and all the myriad of challenges that were exposed during this time. And so what do the challenges that our marginalized students and their families face, and what can the educators and the school personnel who support them do to make things different when they return back to school, whether it's physically or in virtual spaces? Next slide. So what we know about supporting students is that it's like a ripple effect. And so center yourself as the adult in this space and think about how you, as an educator or a school personnel, whether you're a school psychologist, an administrator, a teacher, someone in the district, you may be a social worker, a counselor, or somehow attached to the school community. You may be just a parent supporting families in your community. It's a ripple effect. It starts with ourselves in the mirror, and then it spreads into the classroom. We have to think about how we're all responsible and have a part to play into this. And so if we start with ourselves in the classroom, and then it spreads into our grade level teams, then it spreads into our buildings and across our districts. And so we all have an opportunity to impact and change the behaviors and the practices that have been institutionalized and then disproportionately impacted Black and Brown students across our country. And so I challenge each of us on this call and those who are not on the call and those who may be listening later to think about ways in which we can change and address our own practices and behaviors that have impacted. What ways have I contributed? I think about my early years as a practitioner in the classroom. Once upon a time, I actually started out as an engineer, and I remember working as an engineer and then transitioning to a first grade teacher who did not know how to teach first graders how to learn to read. And so, yes, I could build a bridge for you, but I couldn't teach reading. And yes, teaching reading is rocket science. And I had to confront my own biases because I felt myself gravitating to the same set of students. And I realized that it was a lot easier for me to move towards those children who just had those sets of behaviors that mirrored my own, and that those children who often challenged me either with their behaviors or with the way that they communicated, that I was not physically close to them. And it wasn't necessarily by race, it was just by, you know, behaviors. But I would later learn that that was just the bias that I had adopted as a classroom teacher. So when we think about our own biases and how they translate into practices and how they impact, and then we start thinking about that in the aggregate, that's why we end up with the data that we have. And then we start thinking about how that is codified into practices like zero tolerance policies that are rolled out across school boards, and how we co-sign onto them when we remain silent. We all have a part to play. And so I challenge each of us to think about, yes, it starts with the self. It emanates from the classroom. It goes across grade levels. Then it goes across our buildings. It rolls across the district. And before you know it, it's a state policy. And then it's a national policy that we all have to think about. So I'm going to leave it right there and move on. But I just wanted to put that out there and just give you something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Really important to center the work that we're doing in an understanding of ourselves and our behavior, because if we can't address that, it's really hard to address systemic change. So really, really important message. Thank you. So next, we will hear from Dr. Maryann Woods-Murphy. Maryann, if you can go ahead and start speaking, and I will queue up your slideshow as well. Oh, are you muted, Maryann?
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Great. Yep. So I think that what Dr. Lisa Thomas talked about looking in the mirror and starting to reflect from the self to the classroom, to the grade level, to the building and the district, is a perfect segue into thinking about school and district level advocacy. When we are working in schools, we have to think about, first of all, what does equity look like? What does, that's the NEA, Miriam.
Yep, I'm getting yours.
Okay, there you go. So we have to look at what equity looks like, and then think about what it looks like in our own very classroom. And I'm thinking about this time we're living in. We're living in a time of deep reflection about equity, a time that I've never seen in my whole life. For many years, I've been involved in anti-racism work, and I've been involved in social justice teaching and working with groups of colleagues, but I've never in my life seen a time like this, where so many people are coming together and trying to connect their beliefs about equity. They're trying to understand what that means, and they're trying to connect it to local action plans. Next slide, please. And so the first step that I would ask us all to do, and what I do myself, is I would ask us to ask and imagine, what's happening right in front of us? What's happening in my classroom? What does it look like? What does it look like in the way I do business every single day? Are all students, even in my classroom, receiving the same opportunities? Are they receiving the same treatment? What are the numbers in my school? Who is in the AP classes? Who's getting punished? What are the differences? If we don't open our eyes and look at some of these things, if we don't say, what does equity mean? And then compare what we're having in our own school, in our own classroom, in our own building, in our own district, then we really won't know. It'll be just paying lip service to a beautiful statement on the wall, and we really won't know whether we're living the dream of equity or moving any closer at all. It's really important for us to look very specifically at what's happening in terms of access to opportunities, access to fair treatment, and access to support to become all we can be as students and as teachers. We can look at something, all of us or many of us are familiar with tools like the engineering design process. It's a good one, and it can help us keep on track when we begin planning and creating solutions. Next slide, Maryann. And it's this simple little graphic where we start to ask and imagine what's going on. How does what I'm living fit in with my view of equity? And then we can start looking both through data, numbers, and qualitative data, running focus groups for students, wondering how many people in our school are using culturally relevant pedagogy, how many colleagues are interested in maybe a reading group, how many people are interested in taking action, speaking in front of the Board of Education. We begin to ask and imagine, and then we plan, right? We have to plan something. Anything is better than nothing. Plan something. We have to move it, and I think this is part of the urgency of our time, out of the conversation, out of the book group, We have to read the books, become aware, but that's certainly not enough. We have people dying on our streets. We have students being treated unfairly. We have teachers walking around in a cloud of intrinsic bias that they're not even aware of. And we need to take action. So we need to plan and create solutions to fix the equity imbalance that we have in our schools. We have to see how it goes, try, measure, and learn. Try something, don't be afraid, try it, and then look at how it's working. How do we know? We should ask students, we should ask teachers, we should ask parents, we should engage with stakeholders. We can't just be in our own head. That's why I think that the world of engineering can bring us some clarity around this, and it's a continual cycle of improvement. Next slide, please. When we plan, we have to be strategic. We have to figure out a way that we know we've made any progress at all. It's great to throw out, when you get into a brainstorming session with really exciting colleagues, we can go crazy thinking about all the ways we're going to change school and what we're going to do. There's somebody on the call tonight, and we used to get together and plan everything in the world. But it's important to have that energy, but it's also important to have anything concrete, and using something like SMART goals, that are specific, even if it seems so small, that we can measure it. Did it happen? And I'm not talking about data craziness. I'm talking about seeing whether anything at all happened. Is it something that we can, is it relevant, and is it time bound? In other words, will it happen this year? Will it happen this month? Am I talking 2 years? I would suggest, what can I do this year? What can I do this month? Things that are small steps towards equity are really important, because those small wins, when we work together as educators through our collective efficacy superpowers, we can really make big changes happen in school. So planning and creating is huge. Next slide. And of course, through this whole process, we have to communicate. we have to be outside of our own head. You know, I'm a person, sometimes my family would joke and I would say, you know, sometimes I feel like I'm a brain in a jar. Like I'm so in my own head sometimes that I could think and be in a very happy place, just thinking and having responses to my own thoughts. And sometimes I think as teachers in classrooms or even in whatever role we are, we can get tunnel vision and we can become siloed, even with the best of intentions. So we have to communicate. We have to speak we have to name what we're seeing. We have to dare to do it. And we have to get up in front of whomever will listen, but strategically by proposing solutions and thinking of ways that we can communicate. One tried and true method that I was taught to think about policy changes is, you know, you get teachers or might go in front of a board member or someone in the policy world in their state or region and just start talking about all the inequities. You have to zoom in, right? And you have to think of one thing that you're trying to change. That's why the communication plan is really important. One thing. So what is the challenge? Like right now, one of the challenges I'm seeing come up is, of course, the digital divide, right? Making sure that all students have access to internet and devices. That might be something that folks can think of. So what is the challenge? Half of the students don't have the internet, and that's challenging since we're working online. Then a compelling story to illustrate. This is where we go right down to the ground and we talk about, you know, Harry, and we say Harry really loves to write. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any of his writing because he doesn't have the internet and he can't share the story that he was in the middle of writing on March 12th. And then on March 13th, I couldn't hear or connect with Harry again. A small, poignant story to illustrate what the challenge is. And then an ask. What can we envision? The ask can be, please provide access to the internet for all of our students in our school right now. And the way we suggest doing that is using all available devices and giving them to the students. We have enough in the building that we can distribute. So very quickly, we've come up with a focused conversation which provides a kind of answer, but we've taken it through a 1, 2, 3-step process. The challenge, a story to kind of anchor it into the heart, and then we're requesting something. And all of this can be done in maybe 2 minutes, right? And so this communication is really important and really helps us engage key stakeholders that bring it home. And of course, what we care about the most is our students. So we're anchoring all of this in our students and creating an equitable experience for our students. What can we do as an educator? How can we make a difference? If we listen to students, for example, through communication, do we ever ask them what they think? We can do this so easily through focus groups and through other kinds of small moments of advocacy. And I'll close with a story of something that happened to me. A student approached me and wanted to have a gay-straight alliance. This was a long time ago. I would say 20 years ago. And I didn't know what to do. I said, well, I guess, sure, I can do it. And I was a little bit, you know, waffly about it. And she said, listen, it's our right to have this, and I need you as a teacher to support it. And I said, sure, yes, ma'am, I'll do it. And there we went. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I found myself engaging with resources and helping, but I was serving the people who I work for, the students, right? And she was advising me on areas of difficulty. So reach out to all the stakeholders, and this way we can create advocacy and policy change that's meaningful. So I'll close with that, and I know we'll have an opportunity to speak more after Eric speaks. The last slide really is just building connections, right? We often talk about really, this is an area where I'm growing now too, because I always went to the people who I thought were the network of the willing, right? These are the people who will do the project with me. These are the people. who will read a book or do an activity. But now I think we need to push a little harder, right? And gather colleagues through building relationships that are maybe unrelated to the equity work, but really connecting to this important work, because we're talking about students and thinking of that as our overarching connecting value. So thanks so much, and we'll talk again.
Great. Thank you so much. Some great ideas about ways to take it from, oh, I guess we should think about doing something, to getting to a place of, yes, we can do something, we must do something, and we have tools to get us there. So thank you, Maryann. That was really, really helpful. Last but definitely not least, Eric Harrington, JD, is a wonderful resource in many ways, and will share some of his thoughts about some of the activities you can do in the district and some protections that you have as you are doing those activities, which is really important to know. So Eric, if you want to get started, and I will
Sure.
pull up your screen.
So thank you, Maryann. Thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to join you all and talk. Hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation with the size of a group. What I thought would be useful is to share, mostly I want to talk about the kind of rights that educators have when they're engaging in social advocacy generally and district advocacy in particular. But I want to start with just some concrete tips. And really what I want to do, go to the next slide, what I want to do is really point you to some resources. One of the things that we've been doing at NEA over the last several years is that NEA, our national organization, has become even more focused and more focused on student-centered advocacy. And one of the things that we have done is we've really worked with and lifted up affiliates who are driving student-centered advocacy at the local level. You know, at NEA, we handle national policy, states affiliates handle state policy, but what we're seeing is that there's just this amazing appetite and capacity and power to affect change at the local level. And what we've been doing is trying to provide all kinds of tools and resources so that so that our members and our affiliates can run with this stuff on their own. And we've had a lot of success in certain areas. We've pushed out model resolutions on safe schools and protecting our dreamer kids and undocumented kids from raids in schools. That kind of like spread like wildfire. We like worked on this model school board policy, and literally hundreds of districts passed it. We've done similar stuff with working with affiliates on transgender rights and other kinds of LGBTQ rights. Frederick County, Maryland became this really model affiliate that ran this great program with students and community allies to adopt really model policies on transgender rights. And we in fact provided legal support and sued to protect the work that they had done. We're seeing that, we saw that in dress codes in like Oakland and Seattle. Seattle's done great stuff on curriculum. And now we're seeing this in the police and schools movement. So the first thing, and I don't even have this on the slide, but I want to point you to this because is that if you go to NEA Ed Justice, which is the first like thing here on the bottom, neaedjustice.org/resources, you will find a collection of all these things that I'm talking about. So a lot of these model policies and approaches that have been done by local folks around the country. And then of course, I don't know if I mentioned this, the latest one that has had a lot of engagement is police and schools issues. And so there's our Minneapolis affiliate and Oakland, others that we've been working with, and we're developing model policies in that regard. So there's great resources on that. So if you're looking for, I would like to work on these kind of issues in my community, I just need those kind of resources, they're there. If you are working on these kind of issues and you're having success, we love these resources coming the other way. Some of these are NEA developed, some of these are from other people. Some of these are ones that our affiliates that our locals did. It's really just a collection of what we think is resources that are useful for people who want to affect racial and social justice change in their own communities. Now, last thing on the tips, and then I do want to kind of just be the lawyer and talk about your rights a little bit. And really just in a way that a lawyer can help you sort of figure out what's the right kind of cost benefit of the kind of work I want to do. And I want to touch on a lot of the areas that are hot right now, the kinds of activism and protesting that are required now. But before I do that, I just want to provide, this is also just a resource that I want to point you to, is sort of, we have this very brief, but kind of like really like nuts and bolts checklist of how to get, like, say, school board resolutions done. And this kind of template has been used over and over throughout the country. And some of the other folks have already kind of touched on some of these. And I don't want to belabor them because I want to spend most of my time talking about your rights, and I don't want to talk too long. But these are kind of the checklist that we encourage our affiliates to walk through. And so the first is form an organizing team, and that's of educators, but also other staff, ESPs, anyone in the building, as well as other stakeholders in the community, parents, other community allies, students, student groups if they're the right age. And student groups have been like amazing on, and you probably had this in your own communities, on like gun issues and police and schools, let's say. And then engage the school board and educators and parents and other stakeholders about the kind of issues that you want to be working on. So the one that I've been involved in recently is the police and schools kind of work. And then gathering signatures and other expressions of support, like treating it like a true, like, kind of community political campaign. Identifying school board allies. And when you're working with school board members, it's both, you want to persuade them on the merits of something, and you also want to persuade them on the politics. So creating momentum and petitions. Now we do this through digital rallies, through Facebook, of trying to create that kind of energy that they care about, and having them move their own kind of agenda if they're on your side and they believe in what you're doing. But some of that work is just identifying people, some of it's moving people, and then of course it's also about holding them accountable if they don't do what you think is needed in your community. Engaging media, we have like workshops and toolkits on that, of like how to cultivate local press, how to write press releases, how to like generate social media. And then the other piece that's really important is managing success even when you fall short, which any kind of long campaign of change we're inevitably going to fall short from time to time in pieces. And one of the best things that can be done is figuring out how you're going to handle that even on the front side, as well as holding those accountable. I'll give you the Frederick County in Maryland example. There was a 3-4 year fight to get the school district to pass a trans-inclusive policy. The fight itself was a community changer. It led to conversations about trans people and trans students that changed people, that improved them. So like even just the organizing and the fight alone can create a community conversation. And now I'm not talking like a lawyer, I'm talking like an organizer, which I used to be before I was a lawyer. But they can create the kind of conversations that change even like absent, kind of policy changes. But the school district kept falling short, and they actually had a couple big school board races about it, and they won. And then there was like the next school board race, which was the counter reaction to the successful trans-inclusive policy. So like these kind of campaigns, when they're successful, and we're going to see the same thing with, I suspect, with police and schools, it's not going to be like one punch and it's over. Either way. So that's a big piece of like thinking about like how you kind of do this long term. Okay, now I want to speak to your rights kind of, and most of these are kind of like right to the moment. We've issued several advisories to our members on this, if I can have the next slide. And I want to give you like sort of just a big picture background on your rights to engage and think mostly about local school district advocacy. The first kind of bullet here flows not from a legal rule. There's not a statute or a case or anything that says this. In fact, mostly the opposite. But the reality is that collective action is more protected than individual action. And I think of the most, the paradigmatic example of collective action that was protected that had, I don't want to say this the right way, that some do not think was lawful, let me put it that way. And that was our Red for Ed movement, where we had kind of mass strikes. Had one teacher, walked out and said, we need to fix our funding system and we need to raise teacher salary. We need to make sure we have wraparound services. That teacher would have certainly been fired. And so there's just tremendous power with collective action. And that's true even at the local level. And obviously I'm a unionist, so I think like a real vessel for this for educators is their union. And not every affiliate or local is like really engaged in civil rights, but if your local is not, that's a great thing to do, is to get your local union kind of in that framework and in that mindset. The second one is that tenure and due process rights are really important for our educator advocates. So like our ed justice people like really need that. And it's like a great tool. Now, I think we've kind of turned the corner on this, but for a long time, so much of the conversation about tenure and due process rights was about, you know, the rubber rooms or protecting bad teachers. And I think a lot of our opponents understood what the real power was. I think of the teacher who taught about, Islam after 9/11, who was protected by tenure. I think of even going back to the early days, like tenure was initially passed in Chicago because teachers organized and they demanded that a school board fund their schools, and they retaliated against them and fired them. So, and they organized to get teacher protections. So like your due process and your tenure rights really is kind of going to be like your paramount protection when acting as an advocate. But those vary a lot around the country, so it's hard for me to kind of talk about them in detail. But what I can talk about in detail are your First Amendment rights, and they're more limited, but I can kind of give you like the framework of First Amendment protections, which is the next slide. Okay, so here's a good way to think about First Amendment rights. So first, as a public employee, you don't give up all your speech rights when you start working for a public employer, but they are more limited than most people. So if a private citizen, like I work for NEA, not for the government has very little ability to retaliate against me for things I say. If you're an educator and you're a public employee, the government can't retaliate against you in all circumstances, but there are circumstances in which it can. And so the right way to think about this is that your rights are weakest when you're speaking about private grievances that are about yourself. So the more personal something is, and it doesn't mean like your personal political, but the more personal your problem is, if you're complaining about, you know, your colleague, or, you know, you're posting about your colleague who you think, you know, doesn't do X, Y, or Z, or you're posting about a specific person or a specific policy in your school that is like very personal to you, that's less likely to be protected. But at the same token, your strongest protections come when you're speaking as a person, as a citizen. So if you're speaking about your private stuff at work, unprotected, but if you're speaking as a citizen out in the world, that's much more likely to be protected, especially if you're speaking about matters of public concern. So how does this work? And it's helpful for district advocacy. So really protected is the speech in front of the school board. When you're speaking as a citizen on a matter of public concern, you can raise issues that have come up in your work life. But if it's not like really individualized and personal to you, or you're not disclosing like personal information, but you're really speaking as a citizen advocate, that's kind of like paradigmatic protected activity. The least protected would be complaining to your boss about a colleague. And then always, to be most protected, you should be respectful. And this goes for like everything. If you're posting vacation pictures on Facebook, these are real cases I've seen and dealt with. Regular people are completely protected, like, right? The government couldn't retaliate against Sally Smith for posting pictures of her Italian vacation. I know an educator who posted pictures of her drinking wine and was fired and prevailed, and the employer prevailed because of her personal Facebook pictures. And the reason that happens, and that is so, is that the law allows schools to discipline out of school speech that it says disrupts the school environment. And the argument the school district had, was that, you know, drinking the wine and showing pictures disrupted how students viewed their school environment. So just to sum this up, rights most protected when you're speaking like a citizen. Think letter to the editor, speech before a school board, testimony before Congress, a letter to the editor, a Facebook post, that kind of stuff, or knocking on doors for a politician. Least protected, complaining about a colleague at work. And your protection level on the First Amendment will like vary along that continuum. Okay, next slide. Okay, very important note on social media. Now, social media is tricky because is it more like the break room that's really private, or really like at work, or is it more like the congressional hall or the town hall? And the reality is, here we are on Zoom, like there's no difference. Yeah, you know, you'll Zoom with your grandma or your mom, and you'll have a work meeting, and it's the same medium. And so that gets really tricky. But as a general matter, online speech of matters of public concern should be protected just like it would be in the streets. So if I'm saying my school board should pass a resolution, defunding, and I'm not supporting this as for people to decide, defunding police and schools and routing those funding to other services, that should be protected speech. Now, again, it's the same thing as any other speech. You should be careful about inflammatory or offensive things, because no matter how protected the speech is, you can get in problems with that. And I've had cases where I've had someone, who's literally like F the president, and it gets into a hard case because the sentiment is completely protected, but the specific kind of speech could disrupt the workplace, at least arguably, and so is less protected. So the point is, for maximal protection, aim to be as professional online as in public. Manage your internet hygiene. This goes for, and especially if you become an activist in your school district, or you already are, and you have people who want to kind of find a reason to create problems for you, your like social media presence can provide that kind of opening. And then use your personal devices and not work devices to participate in online any kind of your activism. So don't use your work laptop or your work iPhone if you have, in this world, if you have one, or iPad or whatever you're using in the digital kind of virtual learning. Try to use your own device for any of your kind of outside advocacy. Okay, and I think this is the last slide, right? I think actually there's two more. So this has been an issue, and we've just done an advisory on this. Civil disobedience. A lot of the protest movements this summer have centered around civil disobedience and violating, say, curfews. And this is when this issue initially came up. And this is important for educators in particular. Remember how I was saying, like, you have all these speech rights, and you can carry this sign that says, change the school district, change the president, whatever. Or, Black Lives Matter. You can do all that, super protected. But property crimes are not. And civil disobedience, which is the intentional violation of law, is also not protected. And for educators, an arrest, even an unconstitutional one, meaning the kind of stuff we're seeing in Portland, where the feds are just like scooping people up, even unconstitutionally, and they're kind of admitting it, those still may affect your employment, because there's a lot of like collective bargaining agreements that require educators to notify the school, even if they've been arrested, and it puts them in a separate category. And then, of course, you can be disciplined if you're convicted of certain crimes, and it may even prevent future employment. And there's some states and jurisdiction that if you've got a conviction of any kind, even a misdemeanor, it really can harm your ability to get the next job. So when it comes to property crimes and civil disobedience, and for the record, I'm not combining those two; those are different things. But in those two categories, educators should be aware of can be challenging. Okay, last slide, I think. This protest movements that we're seeing in all kinds of areas, Black Lives Matter, I expect that, we're gonna have protests, I would bet, after the election. And it's gonna take a lot of people in the streets to accomplish a lot of change. We provide these kind of guidances to folks. There's great stuff that Amnesty International puts out about what to wear, what to bring. Really just have a plan if you're gonna do this as an educator. Have a pre-arrest plan, same thing that I was talking about with the arrest issues. Some of our local affiliates provide legal counsel for this. Depends on the affiliate. Otherwise, the National Lawyers Guild does it sometime. So figure that out before you go. If you're gonna go to a protest, say in Portland, or a big mass march where there may be arrests or things like that, figure out what you're gonna do if that happens. Write down phone numbers that you're gonna want and Sharpie on yourself, because the arresting officers can take everything else. And so have that plan in place before you set out. Be COVID safe, wear a mask, keep your distance, wash your hands a lot, and then take advantage. A lot of communities are allowing testing afterwards and do all of that. And then the ACLU, which we've shared, has done a great little one-pager on these protest rights. Okay, I know I covered a lot. I wanted to cover a lot and kind of do like a 30,000 foot on. There's just so much going on right now, and a lot of like kind of just practical stuff that may be helpful to you, at least to help you kind of figure out what you should be thinking about and where you can find these things. And then these are two resources we've done just recently. The NAA Advisory and Student Walkouts was one we did on gun issues, on how to support your students who are walking out in school on guns. We've done one recently on protests. I don't actually have a link for that. I don't know where it is, but if Maryann wants it, I can share it with her and she can send that out. Okay, and with that, I will stand down and take questions. I think you're on mute, Maryann.
I am violating my own rule. So thank you so much, Eric. That's really, really helpful. You know, it's good to know in advance how to protect your own rights as you become or as you continue your advocacy for marginalized students. So thank you, really, really important information. So at this point, just want to open up to folks who are on this. Please unmute yourself if you would like to speak, or if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment in the chat box. I will try and follow that as well. So yeah, what questions or comments or thoughts do you all have? How does this relate to any advocacy that you've done or that you'd like to do at the local level in your district? And everyone's on mute, so please do unmute yourself if you want to talk. So we have a question in the chat from Erin. So if a school employee speaks at a school board meeting, is it best to identify full name and identify as a citizen advocate plus school employee, or just citizen advocate? How do you identify yourself when you're doing this speech?
Oh, that's a great question. And this question goes to a lot of different areas. So I'm going to take the school board one first, and then I'll fill it in a little bit. It is completely fine and okay and good and acceptable to speak, to credential yourself as an educator. So you can say, I'm Aaron, right? I think, Aaron, I'm an educator at, you know, wherever, Poughkeepsie, New Jersey. I teach 3rd grade, whatever. You know, and you can, then you add, I'm speaking here as a citizen on this issue. And I think we should have, you know, we should be putting resources. So we have pushing laptops out, whatever it is that you're advocating for. So you can certainly credential yourself, but you just want to make the distinction that you're speaking as a citizen and not as an employee. And that also goes for like your social media stuff. So you should, you know, make clear, you know, you just should never hold out that you're speaking for the school. So if you're not speaking as a citizen, as an employee, when you're speaking as an employee, the school just has a lot of control of your speech. In a lot of ways, like think about it as they're really hiring, and I'm a former teacher myself, they're really hiring you for your speech, right? So what you say to students, and they have a lot of control over that. That's curriculum and all that stuff. But what they're not hiring you for, don't have control over, is what you say in the public, so long as it doesn't disrupt what you're doing in the classroom. And that's why professionalism and all of that is so important. But great question. Thank you for raising that. And it's a great practice to have. Feel free to talk as an advocate and as an educator. Just make clear you're speaking on behalf of yourself and not the school.
I wanted to address Maureen's comment. Maureen McGurk talked about, as a classroom teacher, how to handle appropriately pushing back when districts have clear problems with equity regarding curriculum and practices. And one of the things that if it's like all over the map, you know, it's like a disaster everywhere. You start somewhere. So for example, looking at 1st through 3rd grade books and ask for permission, for example, for a small group to look through and see who's depicted in the literature. Let's just count. Let's take a flap of paper and look how many people of color, how many kids with disabilities, how many this. And if the answer is like none, you know, or very few, or the only children of color are those in the book about Martin Luther King Day, then you have a clear problem. But the thing I think that's really important, and everyone on the call has talked about it, is to act as a group, right? Get a group of teachers together and do that and say, hey guys, I heard about this idea of going through the books that we're all reading in the 3rd grade, and let's just map out what we see in terms of representation. Now the group has a, we're kind of concerned, you know, we're noticing that there are only 2 people of color and no children with disabilities and no same-sex marriages depicted in any of the literature. So now you have something as a group that you're bringing as a concern, and now the ball is in the administrator's court, or, you know, so I think those are the types of opportunities that you have to make change, you know, action by action.
That's great. Thank you, Maryann. And I just want to note one other question was, how do you find out how district uses federal, state, and local funds? One thing that I'll share is a piece that was done. There's actually quite a bit online. This is just one example, but the information about local expenditures by federal, state, and local is actually now supposed to be available for every district in the country under ESSA, the last reauthorization of the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act law. And so that's now a requirement. It should be on report cards. Now, of course, the data is a little wonky for this past year, given what's going on with COVID. But according to ESSA, the expenditure money, the money dollar expenditure information should be available on local report cards, and hopefully the states are putting that on the state report cards as well. So that is a legal requirement now. And if anyone has any further questions, happy to answer more about it. Lisa, did you want to say anything about that?
Actually, I was going to share the exact same resource that you were going to refer her to, but I also wanted to just add to the comment that Maryann responded to on Maureen's behalf, was that don't reinvent the wheel. Think about reaching out to other educators who have similar demographics to learn how they address the challenges, because it's often good to learn from other people's mistakes, but also their successes and their pathways. And so that's where, you know, peer-to-peer connections really make a difference.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I mean, I think all of one thread that has actually connected all of the presentations to that tonight are the thread of connect with other like-minded individuals so that you can do advocacy in tandem with others, because it makes you stronger, it makes the ideas better, it makes you more powerful, it protects you, all sorts of reasons why that's important to connect with other folks who can help in the advocacy effort. So that's great. Other questions or comments? Oh, and I put in the chat box an example of information on the ESSA requirement, but again, you can just go in line and type ESSA and school district financial information or budget information, and it'll come up. Other questions, comments? And feel free to either ask it, unmute yourself and ask it orally, or put it in the chat.
Hi, Miriam. I can ask a question.
Sure.
So hi, everyone. My name is Bruce. I'm the ECRA summer law clerk. So I've had the great opportunity to work with Miriam this summer. And so I have kind of part of a comment and a question. So one of the assignments I've been working on has been following some of the efforts that Eric mentioned to remove police from schools. And one of the things that we've been seeing is really the power of youth advocacy, that in a lot of cases we've been seeing students who are incredibly savvy with social media, who've been creating petitions that in one case got up to 18,000 signatures, and have really been driving a lot of these efforts. So I was just curious if any of our panelists have suggestions on how to engage or kind of amplify student voices in the advocacy process.
I have to say, I think that the youth are 10 times more savvy than the adults in this space and are doing a much better job. And I feel like the adults are playing catch up, and we have a lot to learn from and from the youth, but we're getting better. And I think the challenge, at least from my perspective and in the work and the role that I serve from AFT, and Eric kind of touched on this, for educators, there's this fine line between advocating and supporting youth, and also the legal lines with, am I supporting you as a teacher and an employee in the district, and supporting you as a citizen in my community. And so I think that until we can help educators nuance these boundaries without opening themselves to some sort of legal exposure, it's going to be a slower walk for us. And so I think that it's complicated. I know that may not necessarily answer your question, but I think that probably the slowness that you will see on the adult side has a lot to do with the potential for legal liability and personnel actions on the employee side of it. And I don't want to speak for all teachers, but that's some of the feedback that we've received on our side. And so, Eric, I don't know if you want to address some of that.
Yeah, I think these are all great points that you're raising, and I agree with everything you said. What I think is most, it's easiest, not easy, but it's easier for educators to support student movements that are already going or that are starting. That is, so, and I'm thinking of also concrete examples. So that the police in schools is one. So this, you know, we got like a youth movement that was driving that that is driving that in a lot of places. And then educators can support that on a public side. The other two that come to mind is that Frederick County example that I discussed. There were LGBTQ students and their families who started to drive the movement, and then the affiliate, and then the union, the local union could come in, the local union leaders. The gun movement in schools with the walkouts. You know, we had some school districts where they were supporting the walkouts and kind of made them into curriculum. The point is, if the students are going, then you can figure out how to help them and support them. What is very difficult, and you probably shouldn't do, unless they're unless they're of age of majority, is you shouldn't be recruiting students to your movement directly. Unless they're 18, you know, if you're at a community college or college, it's a different animal, but you shouldn't be recruiting 15-year-olds to your campaign. You should be talking to their parents, and you should be talking to the communities. So that, anyway, that's how I kind of think of the student movements. When they're going, you can fill in their rear guard action, but you should not be trying to lead students into the streets, let's say.
And in one, oh, I'm sorry, Maryann, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I've been involved with youth activism for a long time, and particularly around anti-racism. And one of the things that, you know, we have a conference in my area with like 150 kids every year from 10 different schools. And out of that conference that are youth-led conversations come actions. For example, in one school, a student noticed that the AP classes were heavily occupied by white students and not kids of color, and they petitioned the school to see if they could have free access to APs, and then the policy changed, right? So I think we have to think of it very differently than the way we typically think of it. It's not my activism I'm trying to teach the kids. It's us listening to what they're seeing. And we don't do that, I don't think, enough as educators. We don't listen, we don't have focus groups enough. And then things bubble up, and not everything that bubbles up is an act of civil disobedience. Sometimes it's a policy change, like they'll ask a perfectly reasonable question, like why can we only use the bathroom once in the hallway per hour? What if I have to go to the bathroom twice? What if, you know, I mean, that's a very simple, very concrete kind of example, but they ask the why not types of questions. And then we as adults have a very critical role here. We have to be youth allies in a way, and not everybody is good at this. We have to be the kind of people who are comfortable in a fast-paced, somewhat chaotic environment where youth are leading. And so often, in my experience, adults are very imposing, and we have our own agendas, but we have to step back and allow them to create plans and let them know what's going to work within a school context and what kinds of things are acts of civil disobedience, that we can be very transparent and say, we can't get involved in this because I'm a school employee, you know, and we can't stop the traffic on the highway, guys. I can't, but, you know, if there's a local group down the street who wants to do that, maybe you want to talk to your parents, I don't know. But we can listen and engage more. And I think that it's unbelievable what they can do when we leverage. It's like the conversation about unearned assets or unearned privileges with white people and people of color. Adults in the system also have kinds of privileges and access points that if we can use this to help open doors for students, we can allow them to do great things, and we can support their goals. So that's what I've noticed.
That's great. Yeah, I think, you know, one of the important lessons on police-free schools that I've seen is, you know, let the young people lead, let the local community activists lead, you know, community members and parents and families, and, you know, and we can do our part and support that in whatever way support is needed and appropriate within the limits that you've heard, you know, Eric and Lisa talk about. But yeah, let's support young people that are trying to make change happen. Absolutely. Any other questions or comments? Well, we are close to time, so I'm going to go ahead and say our thank yous at this point. I really appreciate Maryann, you being here, Dr. Lisa Thomas being here, sorry, Dr. Maryann Woods Murphy, and Eric Harrington, JD, I got to get all the titles in. But thank you all for really terrific presentations and really helping to navigate the waters that are navigable, but that it's good to know the rules of the road when you're getting more activism going in your locality as a teacher. So thank you so much. This is the, as I mentioned, second to last training. So we will have our final Educators for Student Equity training next month, Tuesday, August 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern, on best practices for state and federal advocacy. We'll feature an ECRA member expert from the ACLU, who you heard about tonight from Eric in his presentation, as well as another award-winning educator leader. We'll actually have National Teacher of the Year, Sydney Chafee, next month. So tune in for that one. Stay healthy, everyone, and keep up the fight for student equity. Thanks so much. Take care.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.